Today is the day we end our series on MCC values and purposes. It has been a long and varied journey and has changed along the way. In this series of sermons, I want to leave you with a very important message. MCC is growing and changing all over the world. We must become involved in this denomination as a global movement in order to serve God beyond our comfortable borders. Reverend Elder Dr. Nancy Wilson introduces us to a wonderful new project to the International Task Force of MCC like this. After General Conference in 2010, the governing board sent out applications and went through an exhaustive search to find members for the International Task Force. We also set out a plan and parameters. We were looking for people mostly from outside the U.S. who had demonstrated leadership in their local church or area, who had expertise but not preconceptions. That's difficult to find. Most of the people on the International Task Force had little denominational level experience or baggage, though they have a devotion to the mission and vision of MCC. We were so thrilled at the number and quality of the applicants, and then gave them a huge task. Now, one of the important things the task force did was to review the history of MCC, just like R. Lynn reviewed the history of Open Circle for us. Dr. Juan Battle, one of their consultants, who's a professor of sociology in New York City, met with the steering committee. He analyzed UFMCC in terms of phases during the life of the church. Battle stated that the first phase of MCC was the LGBT church. During this time, MCC brought the message that God's inclusive love extended to all persons, that God made LGBT people and loved them the way they were. The second phase of MCC's development was as the AIDS church. MCC had a full-time pastor. Almost every MCC, in fact, had a full-time pastor of HIV ministries in the 80s and early 90s. MCC congregations around the globe provided pastoral care at hospices and hospitals and helped families come to terms with HIV and AIDS. It is said that there are some pastors during the height of the HIV/AIDS crisis who may well have been preaching a funeral and preparing a funeral service for every day of the week in some of the larger churches. There's no real way to know what how MCC could have grown had HIV not struck our congregations, but it did, and it struck with a vengeance, and we lost thousands upon thousands of members. Dr. Battle reminded them and us that MCC is well known throughout the world for its work in Eastern Europe, Jamaica, Africa, Latin America, and North America as a leader in demanding the human rights of religious freedom, freedom of association, and freedom of all persons to marry. In 2008, Reverend Elder Diane Fisher, a First Nation Canadian, wrote a human rights protocol for MCC. It was adopted in August of that same year. It reflects MCC's acknowledgement of the Christian mission to bring God's transformative love through Jesus Christ into reality by supporting the right for all people to be fully human as God intended. She writes, "We are called as Christians to stand in solidarity with those who are marginalized and oppressed, to be partners in working for change, to be witnesses who call attention to human rights abuses, to be a voice in the international community for justice, to lift up new generations of remarkable, far-reaching spiritual activities, to build on hope and create our future. The task force also spoke with Reverend Pat Bumgarner, who is the head of the Global Justice Team. She stated her belief that everyone involved in church planting should have a firm grounding in the gospel as an instrument of social change. She explained that financial support for the ministries the Global Justice Institute is undertaking and any new planted ministries is one of the most crucial issues for MCC and the International Task Force. The International Task Force looked at leadership development for pastors. And you're talking about in countries where seminaries might be hundreds of miles away, and the cost of such absolutely prohibitive to anyone trying to get there. So they looked at the roles of lay delegates, leadership development in geographical areas, clergy and laity training. They looked at all of the business aspects, the code of conduct and the judiciary, and leadership in general within the church and the denomination. They made this very interesting observation. They said churches often appoint individuals to perform selected tasks that are predefined or characterized as functions of leadership rather than accepting all people as leaders and supporting them as they live into their individual callings. It is the case, though, that no human can lead others effectively without first being led. Servanthood is a part of Christian leadership. Paradoxically, then, emphasis for developing leadership in the church lies in developing servanthood. Now, as a very important part of their study, the International Task Force explored issues of cultural diversity within churches. Now, that is something that we have not struggled with very much, and perhaps we should within our own community. They talked about the acculturation of MCC in the communities that become part of the denomination. The task force is encouraging all of the churches to be open to the rich varieties of culture in communities, providing accessibility for speakers of other languages and for those persons with hearing and visual impairments. Radical inclusion of persons of all genders, gender expressions, sexual orientations, race, nationalities, abilities, and economic status should be a priority. The importance of adapting MCC experience to local cultures has been a major topic of exploration. And when we think about taking an MCC church, most of which look a lot like this, into a country where churches, if there are any at all, are meeting in huts with dirt floors. There's no such thing as sound equipment. There's probably no musical instruments, or if there are musical instruments, they may very well be the handmade musical instruments of the culture. And so MCC struggles against what other denominations did in the 1800s and 1900s. And that there was a huge critique of the denominations that went in and not only were missionaries for Christianity, but were also missionaries for Western culture and in many cases capitalism that didn't fit into the culture of the people where they were at all. So we're trying very hard not to repeat what already hasn't worked. They did note, though, that the internalization of historical and very much current oppression by outside churches and governments can lead to lack of pride in one's own culture, particularly if that culture has been maligned for centuries. What a challenge we have to help people feel pride not only in who they are as God's creation, but also where they live and the rich history of their culture. Now, just as we do, the International Task Force looked at communion as very important in inclusion. Open communion is an aspect of MCC theology and practice that liberates people from any culture that has kept them away in the past. Millions around the world, heterosexual as well as LGBT people, live on the margins, believing they are unloving and unworthy. Finally, in the conversations of the task force, 4 themes emerged and ideas of how they need to change. First, believe, trust, have faith. Expanding and consolidating the global ministry of MCC is not going to be without opposition. MCC must remain faithful to the God who makes the ministry of MCC authentic, as well as trust that God will empower the denomination to bear the witness they believe God desires them to bring. Secondly, transformation. MCC has a transformative ministry. We've seen it right here to bring to the global community. Tearing down walls and building up hope throughout the world would positively change lives, societies, churches, communities, families, and individuals. States of being and ways of doing that are not yet realized must be imagined. Think of it, new ways. If the denomination and the International Task Force want constructive solutions to current and future challenges, then everyone must think and pray creatively and imaginatively to foresee and explore these challenges and envision ways around them. MCC should be open to new ways of being church and of being God's witness. Thirdly, authentic community. Whatever changes or evolutions happen within an organization, it should not lose the authentic voice of the community it serves. In order to retain its authenticity as a globally inclusive community church, MCC must be responsive to the indigenous roots of the local cultures and be adaptive to accommodate the diversity of that indignity. MCC is metropolitan community churches. Community is our middle name. This, by definition, should be a group of people brought together by the community to share common ground and relationship with one another. It is the people and the fellowship that defines what kind of group and community MCC is. Their conversation centered around the premise that it is the people, just as R and Lynn brought to our attention today. It's the people and the members of MCC and the wider community that will be the driving force of exploration of who and what MCC is as a church. Finally, inclusivity. MCC identifies first and foremost as an inclusive church. This is not always easy to do. Any expansion or consolidation of its global ministry must embrace inclusivity at its heart. It was important for the Commission to talk about what it means to be inclusive in today's age and how inclusivity might be seen differently in different times, different cultures, and different contexts. One last thing. They talked about accessibility. In order for church to be inclusive, MCC must be accessible. And so their conversation focused on ways of maintaining or improving accessibility for all members of the worldwide community to the transformative gospel and ministry of MCC. Now this is where it gets really exciting. MCC exists in a technological age now. Failing to use technology eventually leaves organizations or individuals on a back foot as they struggle to keep up with society's expectations. On the same note, an ability and willingness to embrace new technology at the outset can maximize efficiency. The International Task Force has learned that adaptation, just as we know in biologic evolution, is the key to survival of MCC. Churches must adapt to all kinds of changes. Changes in demographics, changes in locality, changes in technology, and changes in people's desire for spirit-filled worship. Young people must be included in leadership positions in churches to keep the process fresh and in step with the times, folks. All assumptions must be challenged, and the church should be continuously reinventing itself. The denominational structure may in fact need to be reinvented again to meet the needs of a widely dispersed local church. The culture of MCC must be adapted as it arrives in culturally diverse locations so that a new story is written for new churches, just as happened here. The history of MCC is inspirational and must be shared with all new participants so they will be encouraged to persist in their efforts to achieve more civil rights and religious rights in the face of oppressive cultures and governments. Inspiration and faith